So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to November Narrative Medicine Rounds. My name's Susan Ball. I am a clinician, an HIV clinician at Weill Cornell, and I am really pleased to have been invited to moderate tonight's discussion, and I'm so honored to be presenting to you Sarah Schulman, who's going to speak to us. I'm going to read a few things about our rounds tonight, and then a couple of the sort of the ground rules for our Zoom discussion. So for those who are joining for the first time, Narrative Medicine Rounds are hosted by the Division of Narrative Medicine in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. The Division of Narrative Medicine fortifies clinical practice by training practitioners to recognize, interpret, and glean insights relevant to patient care and clinician performance from the study of humanities, the arts, and creative work, helping all those interested in person-centered, respectful healthcare to deepen their self-awareness, clinical attunement, collaborative skills, and creative capacities through rigorous narrative training and practices. Before we introduce our speaker for tonight, I've been asked to mention a few basic Zoom ground rules to just ensure that everything goes smoothly. So we'd ask that everyone please keep their microphones muted to cut down the background noise. And if there are any disruptions or any appropriate comments in the chat, you may be removed from the event. We're going to lock the meeting in a few minutes for security reasons. If you leave the meeting or your connection is broken after we lock the meeting, you won't be able to get back in. However, please know that after the event, in a day or so, you will get an email with a link to a recording of this event, so you'll be able to watch it in its entirety at that time. In the unlikely event that we have a Zoom intrusion, we will terminate the event right away. Fortunately, we have done everything we can to make sure there won't be any interruptions, but if there is, you'll get a new link in your inbox to a new session as quickly as we can get it up and running. During the talk, we ask people to keep chat interactions to a minimum. As we get closer to the Q&A part of the event, we'll invite you to submit questions via chat for our speaker. But before then, we probably won't be monitoring the questions. So please save your questions to type into the chat after we make the announcement. This event is being recorded. And as mentioned, everyone will get the link to it in a day or two. And then you can share it as you like. In the end, we'll have a link to the online bookstores to order books or find more information about our speaker and about the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics and the program in narrative medicine. And now I'd like to introduce Sarah Schulman. Sarah is the author of more than 20 works of fiction, nonfiction, and theater, and the producer and screenwriter of several feature films. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Slate, and many other outlets. She is a distinguished professor of humanities at College of Staten Island, a fellow at the New York Institute of Humanities, the recipient of multiple fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, Yaddo, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. And she was presented in 2018 with Publishing Triangle's Bill Whitehead Award. She is also the co-founder of the Mixed New York LGBT Experimental Film and Video Festival and the co-director of the groundbreaking Act Up Oral History Project. A lifelong New Yorker, she is a longtime activist for queer rights and female empowerment, and serves on the advisory board of Jewish Voice for Peace. Sarah, thanks so much for speaking to us tonight. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thanks so much for having me. So I just want to give a sort of introductory talk that will set the frame for looking at one of the most effective social movements in recent American history. So to begin, we now know that AIDS has probably existed for about 100 years. It may have come to the United States in the 1940s, and it looks like it came to New York in the 1960s or 70s. But science did not observe the pattern that came to be known as AIDS until 1981. And the first public announcement of this was an article in the New York Times on July 3rd, 1981, 41 cases of rare cancer found in homosexuals in San Francisco. Now, just to be able to culturally interpret that title, at this time, 1981, gay people were a profoundly oppressed minority in this country. Gay sex was illegal. The sodomy laws were not overturned federally until 2003. There was no gay rights bill in New York City. You could lose your apartment or be fired from a job. You could be denied public accommodation in restaurants or hotels. Familial homophobia was a cultural norm and virulent, and street violence against gay people, which was called gay bashing, was common, and there was no one to turn to in terms of authority for protection. So it was into that environment that this virus was identified. And so the other thing is that because it was a time of such heightened homophobia, there was a lot of anxiety and this cultural discussion about what causes homosexuality. Now, in 1981, homosexuality was seen on a binary. Sexuality was seen as you were either homosexual or heterosexual, and some people were seen as bisexual, but these things were seen as fixed. Now we know that sexuality is different in each person and can change over your lifetime. But at that time, there was a lot of theories saying that it was biological, that it had a biological cause. And some of this was pseudoscience, like that your sexuality was caused by your hypothalamus gland or things like that. So when the headline said 41 cases of rare cancer found in homosexuals, the first response was that this was the biological disease of homosexuality itself. And therefore, the first name for this disease was gay-related immune deficiency, GRID. And then it became known as AIDS. Now, in the first 5 years of the epidemic in the United States, 40,000 people died, and the government did absolutely nothing. Pharma basically was recycling failed cancer drugs that they had patents for. And what they were looking for was a pill that you would take that would make your AIDS go away. So they hadn't really conceptualized the disease appropriately, but if you could find that pill, you would have the largest market share. The thing is that AIDS it's kind of like the word cancer. It's an umbrella term. It's really different in each person in these pre-medication days. And what it means is that your immune system is disappearing, it's deteriorating. So as your system collapses, you manifest different symptoms, like you could get dementia or blindness, AIDS-related pneumonia, or skin cancer called Kaposi sarcoma, or you could lose the ability to process nutrition, or the nerves in your legs would swell. Each one of these symptoms was called an opportunistic infection. And people with AIDS needed treatments for those opportunistic infections, but they would each have to be developed separately, and this was a much smaller market share. So pharma had very little motive to do that research. And the most popular So in the first 5 years, the gay community basically tried to create some kind of facsimile of social services. So for example, Gay Men's Health Crisis had a Puerto Rican social worker named Diego Lopez, who subsequently died of AIDS, but he had the visionary idea to create a buddy system. People would sign up as volunteers, they'd be assigned a person with AIDS, and they would just like hang out with them or help them do their laundry, because people were very, very isolated. I think because of familial homophobia, certain traditional networks were not available to people with AIDS, and the buddy system was often all that people had. There was also a group that would walk your dog called Paws. And then there was God's Love We Deliver, which would deliver homemade meals to homebound people with AIDS for free. But there wasn't really a political response. Not until the Supreme Court upheld the Bowers v. Hardwick decision maintaining the sodomy laws. And this enraged people. People were living in the midst of a mass death experience. There was no help from the government. And here was the Supreme Court, saying that gay sex should remain illegal. And there were very angry demonstrations on the streets of New York and Washington, D.C., demonstrations that had no permits and were illegal. And this sort of turned the corner and created this period of politicization. So in March of 1987, the writer Larry Kramer gave a speech at the Gay and Lesbian Center on 13th Street. And the audience from that speech, everyone decided that they wanted to form an organization. So a few days later, they met together and they started the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP. And ACT UP New York was the first chapter. In the next 6 years, the years that I cover in my book, 1987 to 1993, ACT UP had incredible victories. And I just want to tell you what some of them were so you can see how really astounding this movement was. So ACT UP, working with the rest of the AIDS activist movement, was able to force pharma and the government to change the way they research medications so that they would focus on opportunistic infections. And ACT UP forced the Food and Drug Administration to create a parallel track for experimental drugs so that patients who needed them could get access even if the drug had not gone through a standard approval process. ACT UP forced the CDC and Social Security to change the definition of AIDS so that women could qualify for benefits and for experimental treatments. And I just want to explain that for a minute. So those are two different components. In the 60s, some pregnant women were given the drug thalidomide and ended up having children who were born with no limbs and sued pharma, and they had to pay out all these settlements. So after that, they just excluded women from experimental drug trials to avoid lawsuits. So because there were no treatments, experimental trials were the only treatments. And since women were excluded, they really desperately needed access to these medications. The issue around benefits for women was that the government's definition of what you needed to have to constitute an AIDS diagnosis was based only on men's medical conditions. And women were having symptoms, gynecological symptoms, that men didn't have, and those symptoms were not on the list. So women were literally dying of AIDS and never getting an AIDS diagnosis. And ACT UP was part of a 4-year campaign that forced the government to change its definition. And in some ways, this is one of ACT UP's farthest reaching victories, because today, any woman with HIV in the world who takes a medication is taking something that was tested on women. Because when women were excluded from the trials, obviously they had no data on how the medications affected women. ACT UP made needle exchange legal in New York City, which was a huge step forward and dramatically changed the rate of seroconversion in New York. ACT UP changed insurance. It removed HIV as a pre-existing condition, thereby making about 500,000 people eligible for private insurance. And ACT UP took on the Catholic Church when the Catholic Church tried to stop distribution of condoms in the public schools. Now, this was at a time when, this is before the priest sex scandal, and the Catholic Church was so powerful in New York City. I mean, the cardinal was more powerful than the mayor often, and the cardinal was certainly in power longer than the mayor. And ACT UP disrupted Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in December 1989 and really stood up to the Catholic Church, and condoms were continued to be distributed in the public schools. But I think most importantly, ACT UP transformed the way that people with AIDS and queer people saw ourselves be represented in mainstream media and the ways that the world thought of us. It was really a turning point for self-definition for people with AIDS and queer people. So I just want to say that I was in ACT UP and I was an AIDS reporter before ACT UP for about 5 years before I joined ACT UP. And I felt that, in looking back at that history, it was very important to not be nostalgic. What really mattered was cohering how they won all these things. And so my collaborator, Jim Hubbard, and I interviewed 188 surviving members of ACT UP over an 18-year period. And then I reread through all of these interviews, and I wrote a book, Let the Record Show, a political history of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993, that really tries to cohere what the exact strategies were that made ACT UP so successful so that it could be helpful to activists today, because it's very hard to access activist information. It's very hard to even know right now what's actually going on in movements because mainstream media coverage is so bad. So I just want to tell you some of I think the most important takeaways from this movement. So first of all, I think one of the reasons ACT UP was so effective is that they were not a consensus-based movement. That means that you did not have to agree for something to happen. They had a bottom line. They had a statement of unity. It was one sentence: direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And this was direct action as opposed to social service provision. And, all movements have to know what their bottom line values are, right? So, but if you were doing direct action to end the AIDS crisis, basically you could do it. So if somebody proposed something and I didn't agree, let's say, we would argue, and this is pre-gentrification New York culture, so people did argue, and they were very upfront about their views. But in the end, if I didn't agree with what you were doing, I just wouldn't do it. I wouldn't try to stop you from doing it. I would go find my 10 or 15 people who wanted to do what I wanted to do. And in this way, ACT UP ended up with a kind of simultaneity of action, where so many different kinds of projects and campaigns were going on at the same time in so many different social milieu, using so many different approaches and so many different ways of conceptualizing and so many different aesthetics, that this radical democracy created a paradigm shift. And that this is an incredible lesson for us today, that now we're living in a time when there's so many communities that are under attack, and communities with all different kinds of perspectives and experiences, and they're never going to fully agree. But if you have big tent politics and radical democracy where you can work with people based on what you do agree with them about, and then work with other people based on what you agree with them about, you can be more effective. And I think that history shows us that movements that tried to force homogeneity of analysis or homogeneity of strategy to get everyone on the same page have all failed. And I don't think there's any exception to that. So I think that that's one of the big takeaways. Another really big takeaway is that ACT UP was primarily a white gay male organization. And today that's considered a privilege category, but in 1981 and 1987, it really was not. Yet there were a significant number of women and of people of color in the organization who had enormous influence because they came from previous movements. There were older men who had come from the gay liberation movement, but most of the younger white men had never been politically active, whereas most of the women came from the reproductive rights movement, the women's peace movement, the feminist women's health movement. And this was the time of fascist dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, and there were significant Latino participation in ACT UP. Some students who had come from radical movements who were in exile from those countries, people who had been in like the Mexico City student movement, and then Nuyorican and people from New York City. So these communities, it's interesting to look at how women and people of color functioned inside this larger, predominantly white gay male organization. There was absolutely no stopping the action to demand that people do consciousness raising on sexism or racism or anything like that. That did not occur. What these constituencies did was they kept their eyes on the prize of what they were fighting for, and they marshaled the ample resources of the larger organization so that they could fight for it. So for example, ACT UP had an art auction that raised $650,000. So when the Latino caucus saw that people with AIDS in Puerto Rico needed support, they could just go to the fundraising committee and get the money to go to Puerto Rico, which they did, and start ACT UP Puerto Rico. Or when women with AIDS needed funds so they could travel to testify at hearings or go to demonstrations, and they needed hotel rooms, you could just go to fundraising and get that money. We did not have to raise that money for our constituency. And this turned out to be a very wise move, because the truth is you could spend your whole life trying to change one person and fail, but figuring out how to keep your eye on the prize was very successful. And then finally, everything that ACT UP did was in the structure of a campaign. And I just want to lay out what that is, because I think today we waste a lot of energy doing things that are not going to be effective. And ACT UP had to be effective because it was from the point of view of people with AIDS who didn't have time to waste. So the way you organize a campaign is that you become the expert on the issue. That means that you're not in an infantilized relationship to power, begging the powers that be to fix things. They're never going to fix it. And they, first of all, they don't want to fix it. And secondly, they don't know how to fix it. So people in ACT UP who were like playwrights or something like that became experts in science, became experts in public policy and drug policy and housing policy, and would actually design solutions that were reasonable, winnable, and doable. And then ACT UP would present these solutions to the institutions of power. And when they said no, ACT UP would do what Martin Luther King called self-purification, and what ACT UP called nonviolent civil disobedience training, and then prepare nonviolent but theatrical direct actions or civil disobedience actions that would communicate through the media to the public what the issues were and what the reasonable solutions were, and would in this way pressure the powers that be to move the issues forward. So given this campaign structure, every action was designed with an eye towards the next step. You know, there would never be like a demonstration where people would just stand in the rain and listen to people give speeches on a stage and go home. There would be collective actions where the group itself would be demanding something that they had already designed and could envision. And this was a very sophisticated rank and file. People, there were no official spokespeople, everybody could speak. So the rank and file was extremely informed. And since they were not just following a leader, but they were themselves empowered to do direct action, they were implicated in everything that they did. So it's a very exciting history, and I think it can be very helpful to us today. And so that's just like my brief introduction, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. I think well, I'd like to invite people to submit their questions in the chat, to type them. I have a couple of questions for you myself first. You know, your book has been called the most comprehensive political history ever assembled of ACT UP and American AIDS activism. It's been called a revelatory exploration and a masterpiece tome. I think it's just really a tremendous, such a tremendous accomplishment. It's a very dense book with all of the people that you include from all those oral histories that you did with your colleague. And I just wanted to ask, just to start with, for me as a clinician, I have been taking care of patients with HIV since 1992. And so did my education and training in those first early days of throughout the 80s. And you know, you allude to that first article that came out in 1981 about the rare cancer in homosexuals. And at that point, it's interesting to note that it wasn't until there was like a little group, you know, 7 or 10 or 15 or 20, because before that, just as you say, HIV was in our society. And if people, particularly in urban areas, would look back at their specific hospitalizations of different patients with the, I don't know what's wrong with this person, and I don't know why this person's going blind, or I don't know why this person has cryptococcal meningitis, we would have definitely seen that HIV was burgeoning throughout the country in, you know, from the 60s into the 70s.
I think it has to do with the fact that we don't have a coherent healthcare system, because AIDS was present in the underclass, and people who worked with homeless people at the time said that there was actually vocabulary for AIDS symptoms. Like, well, PCP pneumonia, you know, was called, PCP was called junkie pneumonia. Or they had something called the dwindles, which we now call wasting syndrome. So that meant that it was prevalent enough to have vocabulary.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. But I guess the question that I want to ask you is that, you know, for me as a clinician and seeing the accomplishments of ACT UP, you know, I think it's fair to say that without ACT UP, the transformation that AIDS care underwent in the mid to late 1990s, due to effective treatment, all of that would have been, I think, delayed by years, if not decades, without ACT UP. So when you're with your friends or your colleagues, do you have a sense of pride and accomplishment having been part of that?
I mean, I think that until like the last few weeks, I would say, there's been, I think until the historicization started, everybody who was in ACT UP was extremely bonded. Because don't forget, we had this unique experience that most people never have, which is changing the world and making it better and being effective. And so you carry that forever. But historicization, the first round of historicization was on the model of sort of the heroic white male individual. And it picked out a handful of individuals and made them be the heroes. And not only is that inaccurate, but it's also impossible, because change doesn't actually get made that way. It gets made through coalition and community. So now historicizing it. So in my book, I name 140 people, and there's hundreds more who aren't even included. It takes away that special John Wayne status, you know, and I think that there's a little pain, there's a little growing pain going on around that paradigm shift.
Yeah.
But otherwise and also, you know, as people get older, this first generation really went through a lot.
Yeah.
It's not that well recognized. A lot of the men in ACT UP had problems after ACT UP, had crystal meth problems, seroconverted late in life, have this feeling that they had a unique experience that no one understands. Yeah. And, you know, there's a lot of sadness and loneliness that accompanies that.
Yeah, that's for sure. As you mentioned, you know, ACT UP, the overall picture was of gay men who ran ACT UP, but as we all know, and as we're seeing now with the parallels with COVID, and as the New York Times in the really nice review that you got that came out in the New York Times in May of your book, that with devastating predictability, those who already lack resources are at greatest risk. And we saw that with HIV, and we're seeing that with COVID now. And in your book, almost every page resonates, just not with the just intensity of the different individuals whose lives and stories you're documenting, but with your own kind of fire and your commitment to this. So here we are in narrative medicine rounds, and as I'm a teacher of narrative medicine as well as a clinician, and I've found in my own work, I've found that narrative medicine can be not only a means to better patient care, but also a means of improving one's own sense of self and awareness of others. And so my question is really, so much of your book is the words of others, but how did you yourself cope with such intense emotion in those years?
I mean, by the time I came to ACT UP in 1987, I'd already been writing about AIDS for about 5 years. So ACT UP was not the central moment of my involvement, and I continued over the years. Now, what's weird is this is not the primary work of my life. I'm a novelist. This is kind of like a second stream. But, you know, I left ACT UP around 92 or 93. But in 2001, Jim Hubbard and I started the ACT UP Oral History Project. And I want people to know that it's up online at actuporalhistory.org. And you can see all the interviews and watch streaming videos and download the transcripts. And we've had 14 million hits on this site. So it's a very, very popular site. But I spent 20 years after that doing that. And I've also covered a lot of AIDS-related issues, like I wrote a book that had a big section on HIV criminalization, which is a more modern phenomena, particularly focusing on Canada. And I've written about stigma related to people with AIDS. So it's kind of a lifelong interest. And there's very few of us who started as journalists at the beginning of the AIDS crisis who are still alive and who are still working on it. There's maybe like 20 or 30 people that describe that. So, you know, it becomes part of your way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Did you find just the meetings themselves and being part of the ACT UP, just that communion, the community that was created there was in and of itself enough kind of emotional support?
Well, it was a very contentious community. I mean, you had to be a tough person to make it through ACT UP. And it's interesting because when we interviewed people, almost everyone thought that they were on the outs and that somebody else was the in group. There was, it was a very fraught, extremely dynamic group of very different people that was constantly changing in formation and in numbers. Yeah.
That does come across also. And to that point, also, I think one aspect of your book that really comes across very, very clearly is just that this recognition of all the different movements and forms of activism that informed ACT UP itself. As you said, it's like there was one brief, you had one brief bottom line thing, but how all the different people that brought their activism into it to make it go forward. Now that obviously HIV is still around, and the last couple of years have shown some issues where there's a need for activism. How do you see activism and ACT UP perhaps still exists, but how do you see things going forward in terms of activism for the future?
You mean AIDS related?
Well, I sort of mean AIDS related, but I see there's so much division and divisiveness with so many big issues, climate change, Black Lives Matter, where there's a need for activism, it seems. Do you have any advice for going?
I don't see it as divisive. I think that there's a lot of different communities that are organized. I think there's a lot more going on than we realize because it's not covered accurately. I mean, if you look at the movement against police violence, for example, I really think that there's very specific movements in every city with leaders who we don't know who they are, and that they have very specific demands related to the condition of their own city. And, it would be great if we could find out who all these people are and what they're asking for and how they're organizing. But, we usually read about it the day after election day when we find out that something was on the ballot or something like that. But there's quite a bit going on. I think that the best way to go is to look at the issues in your immediate life that you are part of a constituency that respond to, and look for actually concrete solutions that are doable and motivate a small group of people. You don't need, ACT UP was quite small, actually. At its height, it had maybe 700 people at a meeting. Mm-hmm. Its biggest demonstration was only 7,000 people.
Right.
And just be concrete and forward with demands that are real. And I think that that's the way to be the most effective. If you get too big and too theoretical, then you're lost. I mean, ACT UP did not have empty theoretical debate. It was focused on action. And as Maxine Wolf, who was one of the leaders of ACT UP, would say, when you're doing an action, your theory will emerge because you have to make decisions about how to do it. Yeah. And those decisions cohere your values, So I think that especially in a time of crisis like now, the more concrete your goal, the better.
That's so well said. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to look at the chat, questions now. So I'm reading through them. Could I ask Jennifer Plotkin, would you like to unmute and ask your question about ACT UP?
Hi, I'd be honored to. Thank you so much. This was phenomenal. I've learned so much just hearing from you and your thoughts. I'm really struck by what you said about how people at ACT UP used to argue very passionately with one another, but that everyone found their place within the group. How do we promote that kind of free flowing of ideas today? Because my perspective is movements seem to be a little more monolithic in present day.
Well, I think we're sort of in struggle as a society right now about the question of difference. Some people experience difference as an attack. And I think that can be experienced from two different places. If you're dominant culture and you feel like you should never be questioned, then somebody's difference that makes you question yourself can get experienced as an attack because you feel uncomfortable. Of course, they're not attacking you. You need to find another way to be self-critical. But also the other thing is that sometimes when we're traumatized, people have such a hard time just keeping it together that when the fact of someone else's difference makes them have to look at themselves, they feel like they're going to fall to pieces. And, we need to have a little more flexibility about the necessity of being uncomfortable. I mean, the only people who can be comfortable all the time are if other people are suppressed. And a healthy society and a healthy movement are places where people are uncomfortable and in a place of difference, as long as it doesn't control. There was very little control in ACT UP, and that's quite an interesting element. Like I remember at the front of the room, somebody would say, we need someone to write a letter to this commissioner. And the person said, I'll do it. And that was it. They went off and did it. You never sat down and looked at the letter and corrected everything. There just was not micromanagement. So if people, I think that real leadership enables people to be effective from where they're at, because people can only be where they're at. And if you try to make everyone be where you're at, your movement's going to fall apart. And so it's that simultaneity that's the most important. But if people are not committed to being effective, they won't be.
Thank you. I have a question that I'm going to read now. It's from Richard Klein. I'm going to read your question, Richard. It's a little bit long, and then perhaps you might have other comment to make about it. Richard writes, from my perspective at the FDA, I don't agree that the relationships were as adversarial as you described them. There were very good ideas and approaches that ACT UP proposed, but they were not always thought out well from a regulatory and statutory perspective. There was pressure, yes, to move rapidly, but the scientific, regulatory, and political realms all had to move in tandem. FDA worked closely with AIDS activists to work toward effective regulatory approaches to using new trial designs, innovative endpoints, etc. But the tools that were used had to be developed and validated before they could be accepted for drug development. You have comments?
Okay, thank you, Richard. And I hope that you would write an article about your experience at the FDA at that time. So basically, the FDA was a huge bureaucracy, and there were many, many drugs that were in the pipeline that had not gone through an approval process. What was approved, there were problems with that, AZT. And so Jim Igo, who was a playwright, who was a member of ACT UP, studied the government bureaucracy, and he came up with a plan called parallel track, and basically ACT UP was asking for expanded access. And he sent this to Fauci, and Fauci never answered him. And then 3 months later, he confronted Fauci in person. And then soon Fauci developed his own plan. I forget exactly what it was called. It had the word parallel in it. But ACT UP did a national action at the FDA. It was the first national action of an AIDS organization. And this was at a time when progressive people, if they went to Washington, they either went to the White House or to the Capitol, the White House, the Capitol. But one of the leaders of ACT UP, David Barr, had the insight that ACT UP should go exactly to the place that was hurting people with AIDS, and that was the FDA. So everybody trucked out to Rockville, Maryland, this weird suburb. And AIDS activists came from all over the country because by that point, there were now other chapters. And the FDA had no business as usual that day. They couldn't function that day. And there was so much media coverage, and local press covered people with AIDS for the first time. And eventually drugs were released in expanded access.
Richard, do you want to unmute? Do you have anything you want to follow that up with, or?
Sure. So my experience there was working directly with ACT UP and other AIDS organizations at FDA. And I thought we had very good working relationships. I think NIH also, Tony Fauci particularly. Parallel track was a policy that was adopted specifically for AIDS, but it was based on already existing regulations for expanded access. And it was only used one time, actually, I don't think that the policy, it was a policy, it was not a regulation because there was already the expanded access regulation. But I thought there was a very amicable relationship that FDA had. The October 11, 1988, whatever that was, ACT UP came and did close the agency down. I think that was a red letter day. It was a knock on the door that the agency needed to pay more attention to the community, which is where my office originated. I was in the Office of AIDS and Special Health Issues, and my job originated with the idea that the agency really needed to have a point person and a place for those people to work through. And I had essentially served as the bridge between the community outside and the scientific divisions within the agency. But I think over a very short time, we had a great commissioner that was David Kessler, who was very open to working with the community, to talking with the community. It was very easy to get him as commissioner to meet with people from ACT UP and other organizations. And I think, there actually was a very good relationship that continued for many, many years.
Thank you so much. I hope you're right about that. When I interviewed David Barr, he told me that he couldn't get his phone calls returned. And then the day after the demonstration, he got his phone calls returned. So maybe that ACT UP people have a different perspective, but it would be great to have an event with you and those people and see how you all remember those events.
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah.
That would be.
I have a question from Jacob Gershoni, which I'm curious about too. I was always fascinated by Larry Kramer myself. I heard him speak once. He was such an interesting and such a character and such a force. So Jacob has asked, what was it like dealing with Larry Kramer? It seems that many who worked within the LGBT community were scared of his anger and dismissal for not being activist enough. Do you have some experience?
Well, the myth of Larry Kramer is not really an accurate one. His talk at the center on 13th Street was the catalyst for other people coming together and starting the organization, but he was never a leader of the organization.
Right.
He had a lot of trouble. He had a lot of trouble negotiating with other people, and he would often get into conflicts, and then he would storm out and say he was never coming back. Then he would come back. He would often say things that were very unhelpful. And he really was not a person in the organization who came up with solutions or who inspired people to move forward. But the press had a good relationship with him.
Yeah.
And they often treated him as though he was in a position in the organization that he really wasn't. So that, having to deal with that has been a little difficult historically. Like at one point I wrote an article for the New York Times T magazine, and I said something about ACT UP, and they changed it to Larry Kramer's ACT UP. And I was like, no, that is not accurate. So undoing that has been hard. At the time, the media was almost entirely white and male. And so the mainstream media coverage of ACT UP is very distorted, really. ACT UP's own media is quite inclusive and much more accurate about what the organization was really like. But often it was white male media would just talk to white men, and Larry, in fact, I had a public debate with Larry in 1990 at the Outright Queer Writers Conference. And this was in front of an audience. And I said, Larry, the next time the media calls you, why don't you send them to a person of color or a woman and ACT UP? And he said, but Sarah, shouldn't we use our best people? Which is like kind of funny, but it's also so insulting, just that's how he would talk to you. So, that was the story there. Is there something specific that you want to focus on, Jacob?
I am not really referring to his portrayal at the mainstream media or the New York Times that was quite homophobic then. As Ginny Apuzzo, they did not even dare to write gay. It was always homosexual with 10 syllables. But I'm referring to his writing in the gay media at the time. I believe it was
the New York Native.
He was attacking everybody, and before long, he even turned, it seems, I don't know the dates, he turned even against the organization that he had founded. because
Well,
MHC was not radical enough.
but they weren't. I mean, this is the thing with Larry. Every once in a while, he said things that were really true and really important. And then he had some kind of ego problem, so he had a personal problem, I think. But, he made a contribution that was very significant, but it's not as significant as was represented.
No doubt of that. There's no doubt of that. I mean, even Dr. Fauci says, I miss him. And he was really a fighter, and more power to him. But there was also a feeling, I at the time, in addition to my day job, I was also involved with 2 mental health organizations within the gay community, Identity House and the Institute for Human Identity. We even were afraid to approach him.
He was mean. He was mean sometimes. Yeah.
He was a force, yeah.
Right.
There's another question from Marcia Hurst. This is a question for Sarah. Could you talk more about how the women's reproductive rights movement intersected with ACT UP, if the ACT UP mission, as you said, was specifically targeted to AIDS?
There's so many ways. I mean, if you really want to look at what movement was most influential on ACT UP, I would say it was the movement against sterilization abuse. And I laid this out in my book, because the women who came from, so just a little history, the reproductive rights movement was the radical multi-issue movement that took on abortion rights, sterilization abuse, lesbian rights, childcare. Then there was a single issue abortion rights movement. And then there was International Planned Parenthood, which is very different than what we know today, but they were involved with sterilization. So they were a kind of imperial organization. So it was a movement where some of the organizations were working against each other, especially around the question of sterilization abuse. And it wasn't until 1979 that the sterilization regulations were written in New York City to protect mostly Puerto Rican women living in Puerto Rico and in New York from going through sterilization without truly informed consent. So people who came from that movement were very sensitive to the question of the consent of women of color and the consent of poor people, and was it truly informed? And this contributed to a lot of conflicts within ACT UP, where some people, like for example, in a placebo trial, there at the time, there was a lot of people born HIV positive in New York City. Pediatric AIDS was a significant thing. And there were placebo trials for newborns, where a newborn could be given sugar instead of the standard of care. And the question was like, are their mothers really giving informed consent? Because people felt guilty that they had given birth to a child who was HIV positive, or maybe they had been an IV drug user and they felt guilty about that. And was that informed consent? And so if you're looking at it from that perspective, translated into the point of view of from the person with AIDS, the newborn's perspective, you oppose placebo. But there were people who really defended it because science wanted clean data, and this was something that came from that movement. Or later on, there was a trial 076 where pregnant women in Newark were given a drug that they hoped would keep their fetus from seroconverting, but there were concerns that maybe that drug would affect that woman's future life of medication. And so the women were being treated as vectors of infection instead of as real people with AIDS. And then again, this concern arose, and this was quite controversial within ACT UP. But one of the other inheritors from reproductive rights was multi-issue thinking, because that's what reproductive rights was all about, and patient-centered politics. And so it was quite influential, even if people didn't realize it.
I have a question from Sam Friedman. Says, terrific talk and terrific book. I am citing it in my book on AIDS. Sherry Wolf wrote a recent review of your book, adding that there was a socialist presence in ACT UP. I saw this visibly at a meeting in late 1980s. What is your take on the socialist presence and its effectiveness there?
Well, there's two kinds of socialist presences in ACT UP. So she's referring to organized parties. I think she was in ISO, International Socialist Organization. I can't remember if that was the group she was in, but there were some, small leftist formations that entered ACT UP together or representing that formation. And I think that's what she means by socialist. But there was, half of ACT UP's activities were to address economic inequality. The movement for housing for homeless people with AIDS, the movement for needle exchange, the movement in solidarity with prisoners who were HIV positive. ACT UP was involved in getting Haitians, HIV positive Haitians who were incarcerated in Guantanamo, out of Guantanamo. There was just a lot of work in ACT UP and all the work with HIV positive women that face the issues of economic inequality, and certainly the insurance committee. So it's interesting because I recently had a very heated debate with Peter Staley about his new book, where he came out against single payer. And he said that, that there were soft socialists in ACT UP who supported single payer, but actually 1/3 of ACT UP members did not have health insurance. So it was a movement that was profoundly cross-class. I mean, there were people like Peter who were ruling class, and then there were people who were, homeless. I mean, there was everybody in there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So one last comment and question that I'll give to you. This is from Karen McKinnon.
Mm-hmm.
She says, I'm with the Northeast Caribbean AIDS Education and Training Center based at Columbia. We are funded by HRSA to develop the capacity of the HIV workforce, and it is a workforce that's aging out of doing this work. Younger people are not signing up in droves to work in HIV prevention and care. Is there one thing you might say to create some urgency to continue focusing on HIV among the many other human rights advocacy campaigns young people might find more compelling right now?
Well, given that, please correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Ball, but I think that right now the biggest growing HIV population in the United States is young gay men of color. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think, if it's integrated into medical care for young gay men of color or young men of color, then you have more interest. And also, the groups like Cal and Lord, who give services to poor queer people in New York City, they're very in touch with people with HIV. They have direct services. So maybe placements in those types of services could be exciting for people and stimulating for people. I'm sure that, what's the name of the person? Karen, I'm sure you saw this, but Linda Villarosa, who is this brilliant Black lesbian journalist at the New York Times, had a cover story in 2017 in the Times Magazine that showed that Black gay men in the US South have a higher rate of infection than any country in the world. So anyone who is trying to serve people of color or poor people or queer people, this should be an integrated organic part of their work.
That's devastating. Her article was really mind-blowing, really. She's a great writer also.
You should have her here.
Yes, that's a great idea. Well, let me wrap it up to say, Sarah, thank you so much for speaking to us tonight. I think Joe is going to put up some links to where people can purchase your book, and a recording of tonight's event will be shared later this week via email to anybody who registered. And next month, we welcome I.L. Press, the author of Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America. And I'd just like to thank everyone for your participation and your questions tonight. And Sarah, again, really thank you so much. And thank you for this tremendous work that you've done and you've given to all of us to learn from. And I don't know if I want to say enjoy, but certainly to educate us and really shed a very bright and educational light on this really important movement. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. Bye-bye. Good night.